So, hello everybody. Welcome back to the Journey of Integral Recovery, and this is podcast number 17. So we're moving on here, and my name is John Dupuy, and this is Douglas Prater, who is our producer and co-podcaster, and Dr. Bob Weathers. So the last conversation we were talking about, we're talking about the different parts of the aqua model, and the part that we were focusing on were states of consciousness, which have all kinds of things to do with addiction and recovery. And I have found in my teachings and sharing over the years that addicts really get this quite quickly. They're all about states of consciousness. So I hope you can relate to this. So Bob, the last time when we closed, you said you wanted to kind of talk about, we didn't have time for you to get into. So if you'd like to pick that up, that's right.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you, gentlemen. I've been doing a lot of reflecting after our last presentations on the relationship of stages to states, and just want to introduce this and introduce it more personally and tie it into practice. And so just to say a word about this, about 30 years ago, I did my doctoral dissertation on what was referred to as structural developmental theory. And to translate that into English, it was really stage theory. That was really the basis of my dissertation. And it addressed mindfulness meditation from a stages perspective. And one of the theorists, Ken Wilber was instrumental in that. I have to start with the whole dissertation was rooted. This would be early 1980s Ken Wilber, but there's no bad Ken Wilber as far as I'm concerned. It's just really, really rich. He was in conversation with me and really supported at that time what I was doing, and I'm forever grateful for that. It got me through my doctoral degree. But one of the theorists that had a lot of influence on my dissertation was the Swiss research psychologist Jean Piaget. Piaget is really kind of the forefather of cognitive psychology and cognitive development in 20th century psychology. And his idea is this, is how we develop from one stage to the next is that we're identified with one stage and that we begin to experience more and more anomalies at a certain stage where things aren't working, the rivets are beginning to pop. And he says that the transition is always accompanied by, his term for it was disequilibration. So basically you're moving from equilibrium, where you feel the status quo is working for you, to where it begins to work less and less well. And that transition is rarely accompanied by bliss and happiness. It's almost always through the valley of the shadow of death. So if that's about stage development from one to the next, whence cometh states? And I've thought a lot about this and also reflected on this personally over the years, gotten clearer about it really in our context of our conversations, gentlemen, is that and it's right to the present for me, is that in my clinical work, as well as in my own personal spiritual practice, is that I find meditation as being a way to be able to hold that disequilibration. And let me just say a word about that. I think the typical move is when we feel that kind of disequilibrium, it manifests as anxiety and dread, and you want to head the opposite direction. So most of us will stay in a certain level of development our entire lives. Beyond development up through high school years into young adulthood, many people stay right where they were for the rest of their life. And so to continue to forge forward in terms of higher and higher levels of development means developing the capacity to manage that level of angst. And this for me is one of the real deep benefits for me of decades now of meditation practice. And I want to add, since I'm talking with you, John, and with you, Doug, is that the accompanying, the additional resources I've gained through I Awake tracks they accompany not only, John, you know this, not only my meditation now, but when I'm reading and writing, I'm always listening to I Awake. I just basically walk around with it. The track specifically that I found very useful, and it's buttressed and added to my meditation practice, is the Deep Delta meditation. I find that for me, it's, John, you and I talked about this recently, as a musician, as a drummer, it suits me aesthetically. And I've read enough about the information that you've given me about the value of delta waves in terms of that brain pattern, is that it drops me into a place accompanying my meditation where I can begin to tolerate what is otherwise very unpleasant emotion. Psychology actually has a term for that. They call it affect tolerance. It's the capacity to tolerate unpleasant affect. That was really the subject of my dissertation. My dissertation was Unpleasant Meditative Experiences, a structural developmental analysis. And so I was looking at the relationship of how do you manage unpleasant states and not narcotize them, which I've done plenty of with drugs, or avoid them with all of our other addictive props. How do you hold that tension through that valley for the service of growth, for the service of transcendence? And I don't think it's possible if you don't have self-regulation strategies. And for me, that primarily includes my meditation practice accompanied by I Awake tracks. And also I would add, and it's what you said earlier, John, this is actually what spurred this whole line of thinking. You said, I think it's really hard to move through these states and to develop without others. And so even yesterday in my work at the local treatment center, I was having clients, many of them early in recovery, telling me, what are the 2 things you need to establish recovery practice? And these are clients saying, Dr. Bob, we need self-regulation. And by this point, they know that that's shorthand for mindfulness practice, daily mindfulness practice. And what else do we need, class? They go, we need co-regulation. What is co-regulation, class? And they all tell me it's just what you just said, John, is how is that no seeker is an island, that they absolutely need each other. And there's all kinds of ways that we can talk about that. And we'll come to that later. I think I just want to distill it down to just saying that for me, the one goes hand in hand. And so we talk about states. I've got to find some way to manage. If I'm seeking higher and higher stages of development, and all the positive that goes with that, I've got to develop the musculature. I love your term, John. You call it grittiness. I've got to develop the grittiness to be able to endure or withstand the slings and arrows of homeostasis, which wants to keep me at the old status quo. And I'm a living example of it, is that in the absence of substance, which I'm committed to that and have been now for the better part of 10 years, absolutely abstinent for 5 years, 2 days ago. so that okay, if I'm gonna aim for the long term, short term, I can take something that jacks up my dopamine, but as we just discussed in our last podcast, it's a short term solution,
right?
And that's all it is. If I'm looking for a long term strategy, for me, it's got to include some very, very powerful self regulation formula, and for me, that really is meditation coupled with the I Awake track. So I offer that to you, gentlemen, just for any thoughts. I'm hoping it resonates or raises questions. Love to share. I'm sharing it personally. Yes, my research was on this all those years ago, but I think I've been personally researching it for the last 30 years since I wrote the dissertation.
I wanted to chime in just real quick and ask if either of you have read Ken Wilber's newest book, The Future of Religion, which goes into this in great detail.
I'm working on it. I'm not through it.
I'm not all the way through it yet either.
Me too.
I got hit on, I was listening to it on audio, and I got into the third turning yesterday. I was like, okay, I need to get the book and read this, But anyway, it's awesome. There's so much great stuff there. Go ahead, Doug.
It's exactly what you were talking about, Bob. It's the use of states of consciousness to help ascend through the stages of development, and how bringing these things together is exactly what's needed to help us continue to grow and evolve, and for religions to continue to fill their wonderful role that they have the potential to play in the future as we have continued to learn. It's just brilliant. So that's good recommended reading for our listeners as well, if you're interested.
Perfect.
No, and Bob, you were talking about affect tolerance, and I realized, you did your stuff on stages, your dissertation, but I didn't realize that part of it, which was a key part. And basically that saved my life when I don't know, some 11 years ago now, or anyway, it's been a while. I started using these binaural tracks because I was trying to find something that would help addicts meditate, basically, in a powerful way. And I went through this huge, big, boom, opening, like in the first couple of days. Just I was like, wow, like this is enlightenment. This is what everybody's talking about. And I studied transpersonal psychology, so I'm pretty versed in the literature. So I knew I wasn't going psychotic. At least I suspected I wasn't. But anyway, there I was. And then I was going, this is just amazing. And the speck of consciousness, my ego's real. Sorry, Zennies, but it's true. And if you avoid that, you get in all kinds of trouble. got to account for that. But then again, you know, we're there's just everything. This is, and it's real, and it's what I've always been, am, and always will be. And it's not even something that's governed in time, because time is something that emerges from the big self, you know, which we are. Anyway, all that to say, that prepared me, and I thought, man, I'm just going to walk this blissed out Buddha. It's great. And I kept meditating, and all the stuff, all that had been keeping me clinically depressed off and on the verge of suicide often for years began to come up in my meditation. And because I had this expanded kind of gray state where I could just observe it, and the kind of the wisdom voice said, this is going to get you well. So instead of freaking it out and trying, okay, if I'm just happy, get expanded and get blissed out or whatever again, just stayed with it, and on. And I'd go through these releases and transmutation. It was all happening in the body. I mean, obviously there were thoughts that emerged, but I learned really quickly that, okay, there's the thoughts. This is what this is about. And sometimes you don't even know it's about. Most times I did. Just, you know, bracket them and stay with the embodied feeling that I started getting well. And it went through it still goes on, but the real dramatic getting to that first level of dealing with my depression lasted for about 9 months. And it was that being able to tolerate the affect of this despair before that would just freak me out. And, you know, take pills, let's go to the doctor, zap my head, do this, do that. And just being into the depth of it was where I found God, basically, and where I found healing. So this different language than what you're saying, Bob, but very spiritually valid.
Right. Thank you, John. Thank you for sharing.
I have thoughts, but I am not my thoughts. I have a body, but I am not my body. I have feelings, but I am not my feelings. It even if you understand it logically, the experience is just something else entirely, and incredibly powerful. I hope that we can continue to explore that for the duration of this episode. That's a brilliant thought.
And getting back to states in a positive sense, and when I started, you know, learning about, I'd studied Ken's early work when I was in grad school back in the late 80s and early 90s. But when I discovered him about 10 years ago, again, in his later work, I was listening to an interview, and I can't remember who the person was, but he's a French researcher on meditation, you know, using all this brain stuff. And Ken and this gentleman were talking about it, and they said that you know, you don't meditate to seek states. You know, I mean, and that, you know, we just want to have non-dual bliss and all that stuff. And that's good. I mean, that's part of it. And we need that. We need to contact that deep goodness of the universe to get the A values, I think Maslow called it, so that we can be healthy. That's true, but you can't seek it. It's got to have to come by grace. I'm going to try to do bliss. You'll just get wrapped up in your head. And you have to let whatever emerges. But all the states that you go through in meditation become the building blocks, whether it's going through the darkness and the pain or the anxiety or the boredom or all your, you know, one of the projections about what your meditation should be as opposed to what it is. That's one of the big hangups. You know, you have this meditation super ego, which is the part of you that you should, you know, well, that's a dumb meditation. It should be this, all this stuff. And that'll keep you from actually getting there. That all these various states that you learn to just accept and with mindfulness and spaciousness and the observer, the witness self, actually become the building blocks for your next higher stage of development. And how does that shift happen? I don't think it happens consciously. I think it's the universe evolving through us. Because you can't say, you know, I'm at this stage, I'm orange, I don't want to be green. I mean, it's just not going to work. It just begins to emerge organically or as part of the process. The universe says, okay, it's time to flip the switch here. But yeah, all of those things become, instead of things that we're lusting after or craving or trying to achieve, and which I think Trungpa called spiritual materialism. You know, you want to have these states, and, oh man, I'm really cool, then you're higher than everybody else, and so the ego wraps around that. Anyway, there's a lot of pitfalls along the way. But
John, I have a kind of two thoughts here. The first is all the different types of meditation, and there are many, many, many of them. And what I have found is that experimenting a little bit is good, but at some point it's important to pick a path, and it doesn't necessarily matter so much which one, as long as you pick one and see through it. I read a very brief article from Seth Godin a couple weeks ago who talked about when you go into, say, a hotel room or somewhere that you're not familiar with, and you turn on the tap looking for hot water. And we all know that it takes a minute for that tap of hot water to heat up. And maybe you think that you switched on the wrong tap, so you go to the other one, turn the other one, and now it's still cold. It's still cold. It's not it. It's because you didn't leave the other tap on long enough. But knowing whether to leave the tap on and wait a minute or whether to switch it is an important part of this. And I think that too many of us, spiritual seekers in particular, tend to switch the tap too quickly when we're not seeing what we want quickly enough.
That's brilliant. That's a great image. It's a great image.
Other thought that I had is perhaps as we stick with the practice and start to move through it, maybe you guys could take us on a quick tour of what the different meditative states of conscious are and how we progress through them as we move towards this non-dual opening that we've been talking about.
John, do you want to respond to that? Would you like me to take a stab at it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Or Doug, you're setting us up to answer a question that you know well, so you might just want to talk about it.
Well, all right. I guess we talked about in our last episode some of the things that we experience very directly in our waking lives, the states of sadness and joy and anger and all these different things. And these are all identified with what we call the gross waking body, our regular day-to-day experience, as it were.
All this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, all this stuff. And that is often what we're trying to change. From there, we move into the subtle level of consciousness, which is one of the first that we experience when we start to develop a meditation practice. And most of us know it as the dream state. If you've ever woken up having remembered a really intense dream, or if you are engaged in the practice of lucid dreaming, which we have talked about a little bit, that is an experience of the subtle level of consciousness. From there, we move into the causal level of consciousness, and this is most commonly experienced in deep sleep. But it is also the place that you get to when you work with the Deep Delta track, which is actually free on our website, integralrecoveryinstitute.com, and you can download
Well,
it
that
for free.
was generous. No,
Yeah. So,
thank you, John. Thank you.
No, you guys check it out. It's an amazing track.
Yeah.
The causal level of consciousness is very hard to describe because there's really no content here. And perhaps, you guys could elucidate on that from there. And we move into the witnessing consciousness, where you are outside of all this looking in on the experience. You're aware of the things that are going in your head, and you get here through mindfulness practice repeated for a long time, this ability to observe from a different place what's going on in reality, what's going on in your mind, what your thoughts and emotions are doing. This is where you start to realize that I have a body, but I am not my body, because I am consciousness looking at that body. This is asking the question, I can see all these things going on inside me, so I am not them. So what am I? What is it that's doing the noticing?
Right.
This is witnessing consciousness, or it is called Turiya. Oftentimes, Ken Wilber refers to it as Turiya as well, which means literally the fourth. It's a fourth state of consciousness. And from there, from this witness, we move into the non-dual unity that we have
because
been
in the
talking
witness
about.
state, you still have the witness in what you're witnessing. So there is still a duality there, although it's a hugely transcendent and expanded state of consciousness. And like when you get that, it's like, okay, I'm not my body, then what the hell am I? And then bing, it's like, whoa, oh, now I remember, and oftentimes the mystics talk about it as being a remembrance, that we've been asleep and then we remember what we've always truly been. And there's kind of like, yeah, it's like, it's not new. It's something deeply known and somehow forgotten, like you're coming back to it. And then in the non-dual state, and what is it in, they call it not causal, but is it non-dual? Is that how?
Yeah, non-dual.
Yeah.
Unity or non-dual?
Yeah, unity, right. It's Nagarjuna, who's on the second turning of Buddhism that Ken's talking about, but he was a great, some people refer to him as the second Buddha. That's how powerful his teachings were. And he really criticized Buddhism as it was, that you were talking about the painfulness moving from the next stage.
Yeah.
Well, he was right there helping that along. Yeah. And basically he said that, there was this in early Buddhism, the nirvana and samsara, right? The stuff, the relative world changing, falling apart and going back together again, getting attached to that was suffering. And then you nirvana, and there's no attachment and you're just total freedom. And he said, well, there's a little beyond that, you get to the point where there's not samsara and there's not nirvana. There is just that. There is one thing. There is no difference, you know. And in deistic spirituality, it's all God. You realize that, you know, God is not out there. God is there. You know, it's like it does my iMac or my laptop here have Buddha nature? Well, of course it does. Because it all arises in the Buddha mind. There's nothing that is not that. Oh, it's all God. Oh, geez. What do I do with that? You know? And that's a really good question. What do you do with that? Because Ken has said on various occasions that it's not even more important than the realization is what you do with it. You know, given that, therefore, you know, how do I conduct my affairs, you know, as an awakened being and as realizing this? And of course, you not only have to wake up to these things, but in my experience, you have to stay awake. You know, it's not, otherwise, it's just a powerful state. And in the early Ken, that was his error per Ken, that he was identifying these states, meditative states, as stages, and I could go from this and that, you know, and then he realized that no, that's not what they were. They're just powerful states that help us to achieve stable states.
Changing like the clouds in the sky.
Stages. And so you want to get up there. And I'll skip it for a minute or two.
Let me respond back to something you said earlier, if I may, Doug. I love that image of the tap with the water. That's good. Never heard that before. And I want to tie it into states. Is that my experience, and I'd be very interested to compare notes with you guys. My experience is both personally as well as working with clients over the years. In fact, it's as recent as this week, where I, for example, yesterday led a group, and we begin with a mindfulness of the breath and sensory practice, where you focus on different sensations. When I'm working with clients, these are clients really early in recovery from serious addiction, and we do mindfulness practice. I mean, as part of, that's how we start our group, is that there's a common complaint. I'll always ask, how did it go? And a number of people will raise their hands and say they felt really calm for the first time today, that kind of response. And they'll say, did anybody have unpleasant experiences? And there'll always be a couple of people usually raising their hands because I admire them because they're being honest. And the typical response is this: as soon as I focus inside in this kind of mindfulness practice, what I notice is the flood of thoughts, just you know, in the Buddhist tradition, they call it monkey mind. And that actually can be experienced as anxiety producing. And clients will talk about this. It's like, I wasn't aware of the monkey mind. Back to that earlier image of yours, Doug, I wasn't aware of the ripples on the pond reflecting the sky. And now, guess what? Now I'm aware of it. That's not such a good thing. And so we talk into that. I think that characterizes early meditation practices, that these states can serve as an impediment to continuing on. In other words, the water gets warm and then all of a sudden it starts getting cold again. It's like, what the heck is that? And I think you have to, John, in your terms, I think you have to push through that. I think with more advanced practice moving forward, and this cuts close to my work in the psychological realm over the years, is that with more practice, and John, you actually made reference to this earlier as well, is that what will come up is not so much these kind of subliminal, thoughts that if you just quiet your mind, you're just aware of how much is going on. Is if you stay with it, you'll drop down to another level, figuratively, and that will be where the things that you were talking about earlier, John, the unresolved conflicts, possibly trauma for some individuals, our demons, our shadow, that's where that will come up. And that's another time that the water turns from warm to cold. It's like, wait, what is this? In the Zen tradition, they call them makyo. They have these things come up and they're represented as demons. Is that that's what happens if you de-repress the mind, and meditation is a very powerful way to de-repress. Guess what comes up? The repressed contents that were formerly submerged.
Yeah, good, bad, and indifferent, I might add. You know, yes. All kinds of things come up.
Yes, all kinds of things. And I'll just finish with this, is that if you continue the practice, and I think that that's where a lot of the shadow work comes in. And honestly, for me over the years, working with clients that are spiritually inclined, many of them engage in meditative practice, this is what they'll bring in. They'll bring in, Bob, I started meditating and all this unresolved stuff with my husband or my wife or my mom or my dad or whatever, that stuff is coming up, and I've got to deal with it because it's stopping me cold in my tracks. I can't continue meditating and ignoring this stuff. I can't bypass it anymore. But if people will move through that, and that takes whatever work, John, you talked about 9 months of just wrestling with the demons. If people will stick with that, I think it opens into another realm, even a deeper realm, which gets at what you guys are talking about. It reminds me in a psychological frame, the way that Maslow's hierarchy, at the very end of his life, he included a dimension beyond self-actualization. He called it self-trancendence.
Or self-realization too.
Yeah. The contemporary psychologist Csikszentmihalyi, who's written so much about the flow state, I think of this very similarly.
By the way, you're one of the few people on the planet who can correctly pronounce his last name. I want to honor you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Woo, that was a close call. What he talks about is what gets revealed for me in a meditative state, and I'm blessed with a meditative state. Oftentimes when I meditate, but also, and I'm talking about a more profound kind of openness, the way you all are talking about, I also experience it, and I'm talking to 2 musicians, I experience it when I drum, and they have a long relationship to that state of flow, of a non-dual presence when I drum. It's just, I'm not conscious of what I'm drumming, I'm very attuned to what's going on, and it's a little bit like watching a sunset. As soon as I step outside of it and try to describe the notes I'm playing, poof, it evaporates. And my sense of it with meditation is that we'll achieve these non-dual or witnessing profound states. And the tricky part, and Wilbur wrote about this early on, the tricky part is not to immediately reflexively repress that. You know, when I get into a flow state, I want to take a picture of it. Well, guess what? It ain't there. And I think it's like that with these deeper meditative states. And I'm not talking theoretically. Personally, for me, these states of just openness, what you all were just describing so beautifully, they're given as grace, and the moment I grasp for them and want to take up permanent residence, they skitter away very quickly, and it's always been that way for me. And so I feel like that's another level. Wilbur referred to this phenomenon as the repressed emergent unconscious, the idea that we have an emerging kind of leading edge of our conscious awareness that's accessible only with discipline, only with practice. It's not to say that it doesn't come to us at a sunset, but if you want to cultivate more accessibility of that, it really does require discipline. Having said that, once having accessed that, or better, once having been accessed by that, it can be a real challenge not to repress it. And one of the easiest ways to repress it is just to name it, describe it, categorize it. I'll share this last image. When I was a little boy, I was in 3rd grade. I had the science project that was to, I was going to create a box. It was this black velvet box with butterflies in it with their Latin names. My dad was a doctor, so he had chloroform. And so I would capture butterflies in my little net, bring it in there, and kill the butterflies. And I'll never forget this. This is a very early warning of how it was going to go later for me in my life around what we're talking about. I would pin the butterfly to the little black velvet, put the Latin name under that. So now they're named, they're pinned, they're dead. And I got so thoroughly depressed, you guys. I got so thoroughly depressed. It was like these beautiful butterflies. And how we can do that to ourselves around these states, they're evanescent. They're not meant to be owned or claimed. They're graced as far as I'm concerned. I think we can make ourselves more available to them, but they're given, not taken. Does that make sense, you guys? Yeah. So it's just a way to think about different states of meditative deepening, and then what accompanies those in the spirit of talking about unpleasant experiences or anxiety or disequilibration. What accompanies those is the water gets cold, and we have to find a way to move through the cold water to where it gets warm again.
Yeah. You know, Ken says that that states are basically free. They come and they go and stuff, but stages you got to buy. In other words, it takes hard work. And I love that. And you were talking about Maslow, who was the father of humanistic psychology, or one of the leaders, and also of transpersonal. That what we're talking about in the journey of integral recovery, we're talking about self-actualization, meaning like the old army ads, be all you can be, really be the best version of yourself. But it's also a sense of self-realization, awakening your ground of being, your central nature, non-duality, God consciousness, Buddha nature, however you want to, there's many traditions. And at the higher levels, they're talking about the same basic thing, that what is. And that's pretty exciting, because I mean, any culture without a path to transcendence that is achievable by a lot of us is just going to die, and we didn't know that. We were in the West, we became so, outward focused. And even in the East, they lost a lot of their transcendent stuff, they became old and moldy because, we kept evolving. We know a lot of things now. And so we know so much more. In the last 20 years, we've learned so much about so much. We put all the ancient wisdom and traditions together with our current knowledge and, 70, 80 years of AA. And I mean, all of this stuff. And now that we can put it together and we're talking about A, or some of the things that went before us, we're not talking about, disqualifying them or putting them down, but we're talking about, and this is just in the spirit of Ken's new book, we're talking about adding to, adding the new essential basis, this thing, understanding of states and stages and practice and the quadrants and all of these things. And everything we're talking about, obviously we're talking about recovery and spiritual awakening, showing up, growing up, waking up, cleaning up, whatever order we put that in. But this could be applied to any field of endeavor. It's not just this, so you can learn this basic model and you could apply it to anything you're working on in your life or anything you're called to do. It's really extraordinary.
Bob, I love your image of the butterflies.
Oh my God. Yeah.
That was a hard lesson, you guys. That was a hard lesson.
It's hard.
It's difficult and oftentimes dangerous trying to describe the ineffable. The ineffable. I had an experience, this is maybe 13, 14 years ago. I was living in Austin and San Marcos and was with a friend of mine with whom I shared a lot of interesting experiences and was a significant step towards the deepening of my spiritual path, though I was not necessarily prepared for it at the time. But one day in particular, we're there in San Marcos and we crossed a bridge to a little island there in the middle of the river and had the random idea to see what it felt like down in the water and jump into the river there with our clothes on. And in this moment of wild freedom, leapt from the edge. And the moment I hit the cold water, I had this flash, an opening, a satori, something clicked. And I experienced something that I had never seen, felt, experienced before. And it was just incredible. It changed my life, and I could only describe it as profound. Now, several years later, in talking to a relative, I tried to describe this experience and the way it changed me and ended up not being able to do it and sort of making a fool of myself in my process. It made me hurt and question myself and question the value of my experience and my self-worth and all of this. There's a real danger in trying to catch those butterflies and can cause you to really question it. So I, shied away from it for a while. It was a real hindrance in my continued evolution on the spiritual path.
Because when you tried to explain what was going on, people thought you were nuts.
Yeah, because I struggled to find a way to really describe what had happened and what this moment felt like. It was ineffable. I couldn't explain. I didn't have the language for it. I don't know that there is appropriate language for it, but made me question what I had experienced in a way that I shouldn't, because many years later now, with continued meditation practice and some increased clarity, I have a better understanding of what had happened. But there are people who, at least in my experience, will try to detract you, people who aren't ready to hear it, people aren't open to those kind of experiences, or who haven't understood what it was that happened when you had an opening, question your sanity, as it were.
Yeah. And well, Jesus said, don't cast your pearls before swine, which is a really interesting, or else they'll turn and rend you. It's a really powerful metaphor. Not saying these people are pigs, but I'm saying, don't reveal your kind of deeper truth or deeper stuff to people who aren't ready for it, because they just won't hear it and they may get hostile,
I've got a story, you guys. I haven't thought about this in years. I think you'll both appreciate it. You may be familiar with it. It's kind of a legendary story ascribed to the composer Beethoven. And as it was in those days, composers made their living being having patrons, you know, support them in their work. And so Ludwig van Beethoven, he had a very wealthy baron who was his patron, and commissioned him to write a sonata, a piano solo sonata. And so Beethoven did that, at the end of which the baron called him into his court with the piano and said, play it for me. So Beethoven played the entire sonata. He was an incredible pianist. And upon the completion of that, the patron looked at him and said, that's beautiful, Ludwig, but what does it mean? And what Beethoven's response was, he played the sonata exactly one more time, played it one more time, slammed the piano closed and walked out and never came back. That was his response.
Which may lead us into types, which is our next subject. Don't say that to a 4. They'll slam the piano down and they'll walk out of the room.
I'm glad I set it up that way. Thank you, Ludwig.
And I was interested, getting back to you, Doug, and your experience when you hit the water. It's like I was blessed by that same river, a lot. The San Marcos River, an amazing river. And, I mean, you're here with supportive, loving people. Do you think you can F the ineffable and screw the inscrutable here? That maybe kind of.
Oh. Wow.
I mean, because it's such a vivid image. I can imagine you sit in the water, all of a sudden the universe blows open.
Yeah, just
wham,
opened wide up, and I was right there, fully present, and the feeling of the water was a part of me. And I was very awake. I was immediately lucid, but I wasn't thinking about it. I was very, very present and one with everything that was happening in that moment. There was nothing outside of that moment. There was no past. There was no future. There was no difference between me and the water and my thoughts. And it just all suddenly was. And I don't know I don't know how else I can describe it.
That's beautiful. I'm totally, it wasn't a thought. This was just there.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
You remind me, listening to you, thank you, Doug, for being willing to share with us. You remind me, even in the descriptions you used, and I think it gives me a new appreciation. I mentioned him earlier, and John, you complimented me on the pronunciation of his name. He's got one of these Slavic names that doesn't have any vowels in it. I don't know how many C's and Z's and S's can you put in a row. But the title of his book and of his theory is easy to remember. Miayi Csikszentmihalyi is the author, and he's written a series of books that have been deeply influential. His books on creativity have really been formative for me. But the theory is based, and he's the one who named it, he just simply called it flow, F-L-O-W. And he lists 8 characteristics of flow that would be 8 characteristics of describing the ineffable, including one of the characteristics is its ineffability, but the sense of being out of time, the sense of being an absence of a sense of self, a sense of this experience is an end in and of itself. It's not a means to something else, and so on it goes. And I love what he did. Csikszentmihalyi was at the University of Chicago for years, and he did an international study, you guys. It's very cool. He hooked people up to a little beeper on their belt, and he would, and this was thousands of subjects, he would beep them at various times randomly during the day and ask for them to write down what they were feeling right at that moment. And he compiled all of this and then sifted through all the records and came up with this, is that when people talk about being happy, it's never about what we would think. It's not about my new car or aren't I famous or this kind of thing. It was what you just talked about, Doug. And so, and the paradox of it is that what makes people happy is least easily described. But he went about the process of trying to stick close to the experience, compiling this through the day after day with subject after subject, and then came up with this theory of flow. And so what he calls the basis of happiness is this kind of ineffable, indescribable, absolutely universal experience. Didn't matter what culture, he did it across multiple societies. It's really extraordinary. And I believe that for me, it ties directly into what we're talking about in terms of states, is that these higher states We all get, I love the way that Wilbur talks about this. We can get a peek into them, P-E-E-K. We can peek into a peak, P-E-A-K experience. And that's given to us just graciously, I mean, just purely by grace. And then, John, as you know, and you too, Doug, is that you can actually cultivate a psyche that's more and more fertile and open to this possibility. So the experiences that we have of jumping off of bridges into water or with music, you can cultivate that through meditation, other means where you're no longer peeking at it, you're actually beginning to have more and more of that experience kind of seasoning your day-to-day. But I love the way that he talks about flow, and I'd recommend that to our readers. It's a very accessible book. It's not a technical book at all, and it roots itself in really kind of speaking the unspeakable. But he does it in a poetic enough way. He doesn't depart. He doesn't reduce it down. He doesn't turn it into a butterfly that's been pinned to a black velvet mat. He really stays closely to it, and it absolutely matches my experience over the years, including with meditation. John, you asked me, how does it go? We talked about this with the I Awake tracks and meditation. The other morning I shared with you, I meditated for 2 hours with the deep delta going, and the place I go into, it is self-reinforcing. I'm going nowhere, and that's the nowhere where I want to live.
Yeah.
And it opens up. It's buoyed for sure by the I Awake, for me, the deep delta tracks, and then just years and years of practicing. Like you said, Doug, I stick with the same practice now for 35 years. I just, I found something, and I just keep doing it, and it keeps, getting more and more nuanced. But it accesses this state that Csikszentmihalyi is talking about, and it's universally accessible. There's not a one of us on the planet that can't access or be accessed by flow.
And I just did a trip to California recently. I got a chance to hang out with Arjuna Arda, who is the author of the Translucent Revolution, and on the Spiritual Tech Talks season 2. 2.0 season 2. I was interviewing. He was talking about the new book, and he sent me the first 8 chapters. It's not published yet, but he talked about this kind of cycle, and it starts up at 12 o'clock at being just emptiness, and we're talking about the emptiness of meditation, where just no thought, nothing. Not body, not mind. Mind body drop. This is Zen koan. It's just the pure isness of it. And then it moves from emptiness into the flow state, which is at 3 o'clock, which is at birthing, that incredible, revelation. I've got to do this and that, and it all comes together. And then it moves down into 6 o'clock, which is where you really got to put it together. You got to take the vision, that emerged from emptiness into the flow, and just hammer it down, do all the work, get the podcast going, figure out how to get the doggone microphone to work, and just, all the myriad things it takes to do a project. And then after that, you move into, and first I was kind of dubious of this part, but you move into this part where you're just not uncomfortable in your own skin anymore. And the last thing you did looks kind of stupid. And, you start self-criticizing, the ego comes up, and all the fertilizer of our own neuroses come, which is good stuff. And you kind of hang out in that for a while. And hopefully you're beginning to do it with mindfulness, because all this stuff, instead of saying, a friend said, don't say, oh shit, say, oh fertilizer, because when stuff happens, it's there to help us grow. And I was really experiencing that the last few days. It's like, just being sick and I said, oh God, this is what Arjuna was talking about. And then from there, you begin to move back to, 12 o'clock, emptiness. And then it starts going over. So as you become mindful of these interior processes and perhaps cycles of creativity and creation, then we don't have to freak out. It's like, oh my God, I want to be in the flow state forever. No. That's just like, loving dawn and want everything to be done. That's not what's going on. So you begin to have this expanded awareness and wisdom, and, you go through these different cycles, and it goes back to what you were saying, Bob, about moving from these different stages, right? From, say, blue fundamentalist, mythical thinking into modernistic scientific, individualistic freedom, blah, blah, blah. And then you move into green, which is communitarian, all beings, this stuff. And it's quite painful sometimes, especially I think it's even more painful the earlier stages you are. However, I think once you get to kind of the second tier thing, which is this big leap from green and the postmodernism into this integral thing that brings it all together and shows how it all fits, that the transitions become less painful and less discordant, because you realize you know this is evolution, how it goes, and you've kind of learned, and you go, well, here we go again, you know.
Yeah,
and
that
that's
sounds
fine,
right.
you
That
know?
sounds right. Yeah, I bet you're right about that. I like that, John. I've never thought of that before. It stands to reason, doesn't it? Is that as we become more and more integrative of the whole, then the changes are less and less. In psychology, we say ego dystonic. They're not dissonant with your sense of self, because your sense of self is already so expansive and inclusive. Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah.
And you become less and less likely, as you start to integrate that, to run from it or cover it up by switching off to a substance, and realize the wholeness unfolding before you is far better than anything you could have done artificially with a drug.
Yeah, and you know, I think I don't think we get perfect in the sense of ego projection in this life. I never met a perfect human being ever. Anybody claims it anyway, that they're pulling a con or they're really deluded. But you know, and all of our stuff, you know, we do release it, but there are always impressions that remain. There's always a story there that we can, you know, re-access and go back there and understand it. But you know, and one of the things that's so important, we're talking about and stages and stage development and addiction, as we get into the stages of recovery, right? Which you could say, same thing, spiritual stages. I mean, all these things are parallel, if not the same thing.
I know we're winding down here, but it's synchronistic, John, that you had mentioned stages of recovery. Just this morning when I awoke, I went to our Journey of Integral Recovery Facebook, the community. It's the blog site, or whatever the term is for it. And that was exactly the topic that you talked about. That so you have this engagement from people that are listening to this material, reading your book, interacting with this material, working integral life practice, talking about stages of recovery. And I'd love the conversation. I guess this is an indirect sales job. I really want to encourage listeners to get involved, because it's like taking this, moving it into a community context, and actually digging deeper and deeper and deeper with this material. And today's topic, interestingly, John, was stages of recovery.
And this will lead us into next week's thing. And I remember I was talking about that as you move into these things, you know, you transcend and include. In other words, you know, all your battles with alcohol and drugs don't go away. All my battles with depression or whatever, they're still there. They're part of me, but they're no longer the controlling subject. And Keegan said that every time you advance a level, the subject, the I-ness of the last level becomes an object of the preceding level. So the addict self is no longer controlling you, saying that you have a stable, you know, all the necessary lines of development. And I think when that happens, that we become more accepting of ourselves as imperfect beings, and we can laugh about ourselves more, and we can be more forgiving and humble and loving of others, because we realize that, you know, hey, at 60 years old, you know, it's like, John's probably going to be John, you know. And that's just the way it is, you know. And let's see how we can line that up so that it does some good in the world, you know. And
we love you. We love you, John. We love you, John, just as you are.
And so you begin to love, and then it helps. Of course, it's the big. I think the big job is self-forgiveness for a lot of us, and then we can move on to forgiving others in a real way, which is a whole nother. Well, you've talked about it brilliantly before, Bob. So thank you so much, you guys. We love you.
Thanks,
and
gentlemen. Thank you.
Anyway, God bless. See you next time.
Blessings. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.